Hello there, in this video we're going to talk about the best tools to use if you are a concept artist, and also just be talking here on the side, and then on the left I'll display various things. Hopefully it's not too distracting, but let's get started. Alright, so if you're a concept artist, there's probably always a tool that you use to make your visuals, and right off the bat, if you're looking for what is the most used tools in the industry, then it's Blender and Photoshop. Those two tools are pretty much the closest thing we have to an industry standard in concept art. So if that's all you want to know, then there you have it. But if you want to learn about some more tools and explore some things, then keep watching, because we'll go through a whole bunch of things. So what I'll be doing is I'll create some sort of list and kind of talk about the different software, and I'll be dividing them into two categories: 2D and 3D. So before we start, I just want to say that there is no industry standard tool for making concept art. Concept art is pretty much pipeline independent, which means that nobody's relying on a specific asset type or tool type or something from you to be able to do their job. What you're providing is an idea, a visual of an idea for something, and then somebody else will take that and make it into a character, environment, creature, or something. So you can pretty much, in broad strokes, you can pretty much choose whatever software you want for your art. But I will say there are a few exceptions I just want you to consider as well. First off, if you are working as a concept artist in a concept art house, then they might have a certain pipeline or certain set of tools that they use, because the artwork that's being made is switching hands a lot. So they might decide to, say, we're only using Photoshop here, so everyone can open the Photoshop files and use the similar tools, for efficiency and so on. Or they might be using something like Blender to have transparency between the different assets and so on. So something to be considered there if you're working at a concept art house, so a company that specializes in making concept art for clients. This could also be the case in larger game studios or film studios, where they might have a concept art team and then they have a pipeline. But I think it's most likely you'll see this in concept art houses. Secondly, if you're working in 3D, like doing architecture or sculpting or something like that, then it can happen that whoever you're working for will require that asset for reference, right? So if you created a 3D sculpt, then the modeler who's needs to receive it next might want that model for reference, in 3D space. So there they could say that we actually want a ZBrush file, so you would have to work in ZBrush to fill out those needs. But that's really a case-by-case basis, but that could also feed into a pipeline or something. But it's something to consider, and depending on the kinds of clients you want to work with and the kind of work you want to do, then it's something there to consider what tool you might want. So I hope that is clear, and then we'll just move on to start talking about the 2D tools. So right off the bat, we're going to start with a big one: Photoshop. So Photoshop is probably the one you all know, right? It's pretty much the standard. It's what everyone uses, it's what everyone has used, and it's pretty hard to get away from, just because it's so big. And it's kind of silly, because Photoshop was not meant for painting or making illustrations in this way. It is meant for editing photos, right? It's in the name, Photoshop. But somehow everyone is using Photoshop, and I think there's not much to talk about. I think most of you know what it's about. It has some awesome features for adjusting your image, and it actually doesn't have that many great features for painting, but people use it anyways. And I think there's a sort of raw quality to how Photoshop works. With the brushes, it doesn't have too many advanced features, but still it's kind of enough. And somehow the simplicity of the painting, for me at least, works really well, because it's just very dead on. It's not trying to do any kinds of effects, which I personally like, but some of the other software we're going to look at is a bit better at dealing with some of those edge cases. For what I do, it works really well. So definitely it's pretty much an industry standard. But then again, it's also, you're creating 2D content, so you might not be super required to use it. But once again, depending, right? Cool. So that's just Photoshop, then it's there, right? Then the next one, if you don't know it, then there's something called Clip Studio Paint. Clip Studio Paint is pretty popular among comic artists and people who draw anime style things, and it's really great for both painting and doing especially line work. And if you're the kind of person doing comic panels or something like that, so depending on your style, if you're doing really line heavy things and like that sort of things, then I would actually consider recommend you checking out Clip Studio Paint. just because it has an advantage when it comes to making those kinds of things, like far superior to Photoshop. It's also a much more kind of painter draw friendly environment as opposed to Photoshop that's more on photos. I don't use it personally. I like the way Photoshop works, but Clip Studio Paint, definitely, if that's the kind of stuff you're doing, like more drawn things, I think you should check it out if that's kind of your niche, right? Then I think that one's a great one. Then there's a tool called Corel Painter. Corel Painter is sort of a mix, right? It's a bit more about painting and drawing, and also more artist, or like not artist friendly, but like painter drawer friendly, right? And some people really like it. I don't see it used that much. There are a few, maybe I think a little more of an older generation who use it. I don't see it out there in the industry. It's very rare that I see it. But some people, swear to it, and they just find it more fun to use. So if you can get over that hump and want to try something more painterly, then try out Corel Painter. Still, for me, Photoshop is just fine. So yeah, that's pretty much how this is gonna go down. I'm gonna do something and I'm gonna compare it to the tool I use, but I try to highlight some of the special features of this software. So Corel Painter, check it out. Then there's this tool called Rebelle 4. It's not a huge tool at all. It's a pretty small tool, but it does have some special features for making things look traditional. So it has all these simulated painted effects and very, very focused on that traditional painted look. So if you're looking to do something like that and really get that feel of oils mixing together, maybe you're coming from a traditional background and you want to branch over and you don't really like the digital flow, it has like a miscommunication or it doesn't really work for you, then I think you should check out Rebelle 4. Of all the software I've seen, there's also Art Rage and Paintstorm. Some of these have some similar features with these painting things, but I feel like Rebelle 4 has most of those features. If you know of any better ones, then please write me. But from what I've seen, then Rebelle 4 is the one that allows you to do most of this kind of painterly aspect. Then we have Krita, which is the free one on the block. There's also some other free ones, I think, but I think Krita is the biggest one. It's pretty big software, and if you're looking for a free alternative to Photoshop, then Krita is actually really great. It's improved a lot over the years, and I think the performance is really good now. It has a lot of really nice features and a really nice perspective tool in particular. I've used Krita a little bit here and there, but I always fall back to Photoshop. My hope is actually to switch completely over to Krita, but there are just a few little things that bug me, that I'm just so reliant on in Photoshop. And also then again, there's that industry standard. So if you're working in-house, then you just gotta use Photoshop. So the Photoshop files, even though Krita supports Photoshop files, then it doesn't really, gel. It's just better to use the software that is there. And it also has this really nice animation tool set. If you want to do some light animation as part of your workflow, then I think Krita is super open to that as well. Then we have two extra tools I want to talk about on the iPad, which I see more and more people using. The first one being Procreate, which probably you heard about before. Procreate is a really nice tool, but also it's only available if you have an iPad. And if you want to do work on the iPad like that, which you can, I think it's at the point where Procreate can be a serious, tool, professional tool, especially when you need to make something like concept art. Procreate is really nice. It's very kind of like Corel and Clip Studio is very artist friendly, but it does feel a little bit more similar to Photoshop in some ways, but it has this artist friendly nature. Once again, when I say artist, I just mean painter friendly. And I think it's quite nice. It's a quite nice tool. I have it myself, and I have an iPad, and then I use it once in a while. And it's and I definitely know some people who prefer Procreate over any other tool. Like this is the most fun way, because you're just sitting there and it feels more like this bridge between digital and traditional. So that's super nice. The other one is Sketchbook Pro, which you can get for the iPad. You can also get it for web. Sketchbook Pro is a little bit more for doing kind of maybe sketches, it's kind of in the name there. I think a lot of the marketing with Sketchbook Pro is that you can use it for doing car designs and kind of having these sketchy lines. And similar to Clip Studio Paint, it has a very good tools for making lines and those kinds of things, that where Photoshop is not really that great at those things. Both Sketchbook Pro and Clip Studio Paint are really good for making those things. So if you're interested in making having nicer tools for doing those things, then maybe check those things out. The last thing here to look at in 2D is traditional, and by that I mean good old pencil and paper, paint and canvas or something like that. It's less common to see it in concept art, also just because of the impracticalities, right, with working online. But it does happen. The people will do things, sketching by hand or sketching in the book, and it can be part of your workflow, of course. I use it less and less and less and less. It's very rare that I sketch, but something I always do, always do. On my desk, I always have some paper nearby, and I pull it in front of me to sketch down ideas. So these are very rough, it's not something I would take a picture of, but just if I need to solve something, solving a character, blocking something out, solving a little composition of a thing, just jotting down an idea. And I think that part, traditional, is almost, I can't see how it could be replaced for me. I could do it in Photoshop, but there is a sense of kind of taking your mind off the screen and just staring at the paper on your table, right? There's a connection there, and a simplicity and a speed in a way that I just don't get with Photoshop. And it kind of stays there, right? It's just there on the table. I could put it up to the side, and I could do the same thing on digitally, right? But it doesn't disappear amongst all the other things you have going on your computer. So I think there's something really nice about the traditional aspect of concept art there that I like in my workflow, and I know other people also do that. You have a little note block in front of you, then you use that for just contemplating and developing ideas. So I recommend having a little notebook, if nothing else, just for those kinds of things, if it makes sense. Alright, that's pretty much what I want to say about the 2D tools. I'll do a conclusion in the end on everything, but for now let's move on to talk about the 3D. Alright, let's look at the 3D, and this is probably the stuff you may be the most interested in, also based on the content of the channel, and there's a lot to talk about here. And we'll start off with the big boy again, which is Blender. So obviously I do a lot of Blender content on this channel, and it is the primary 3D tool I use, and it's kind of the balance between Blender and Photoshop right now is what I use to do concept art. And I think for all the 3D tools, I will be actually just comparing them to Blender, because some of them I recommend strongly for other aspects, but some of them I'll also just directly compare and say, don't use that tool, just use Blender instead. But we'll go through them and then you can see. But I think I'll just justify why Blender is in the position that it is now. It is pretty much the closest thing we have to an industry standard for doing 3D in concept art, right? So there's all these other tools, but Blender is pretty much the one right now. And I think it's because it is this accumulation of a bunch of different tools that all kind of work in the same kind of workflow, right? So you have animation, you have rendering, you have modeling, you have sculpting, you have grease pencil, you have compositing, you have all these tools, and they all work similarly. So that means that for the artist point of view, if you're investing time into a software, then all those skills, they're not far from each other to learn those things, and you can just keep them there. And a really big factor is speed. Blender is fast, but there's also a slowness in switching software, and I know for me that's a huge thing. I feel I'm slowed down if I have to switch software. Sometimes a certain goal is only achievable if you're working with a specific software, and that's fine, but Blender really allows you to do so much and so fast, and speed is really everything in concept art, because you have to produce a lot of content very fast, and I think that is why Blender is in this position. Blender is also very fun to use in comparison to many other 3D packages that I've used. It just feels more fun to do, I think, across the board, to do all the things. I don't know what it is. I think it's something with the user interface and the accessibility, and of course it's lacking features that other software has, but the combination of things and the plug and play nature, I think that's really, really nice. And on top of that, it's a free software, so everyone has access to it, which also is democratic, right? For the creativity that is out there, everyone can kind of dig their hands into it and do something. So I don't think I want to say a lot about Blender besides those things. I think if you're doing concept art and you're doing especially things like environments and scenes and stuff like that, I really think Blender is a no-brainer, And even if you're more reliant on 2D, just using Blender for blocking out perspective and things like that is just great. And I think it's better to use that than to use perspective tools in Photoshop, to be honest. Just my opinion. So yeah, that's pretty much what I want to say on Blender. I think it's almost a no-brainer. So there you have it. Next up, we're going to talk about 3ds Max and Maya. They are, both owned by Autodesk. They're a little bit different, but I'm going to kind of bunch them together here. I think both of them now, in this day and age, if you are doing concept art, unless you have a very specific workflow and work in a very specific studio where they do things in a certain way, then I would recommend you switch to Blender. If it's something you've used or something you're considering using, then I think just put your eyes on Blender. It makes more sense on all the fronts. There's so much more support for it now also, and tools and workflows that are Blender centric. And yes, some of them are getting nicer viewports and rendering options, etc. And yes, both 3ds Max and Maya are getting nicer viewports similar to Eevee and things like that, but it's nowhere near the same level of competence that we see in Blender. If you're doing more industry heavy pipeline stuff, then sure, go for Maya and 3ds Max, but we're talking about concept art. I think both in terms of modeling and look dev, Blender is just stronger than both of them. So I would actually not recommend those tools unless you have something that depends on it in your pipeline. Next up, I want to talk about Cinema 4D. It's a little bit the same story with Maya and 3ds Max, that I think you should just switch your gears to using Blender unless you're doing things that are very graphically heavy. So maybe motion graphics design or something like that, which also needs to be, sometimes there's concept art involved in that, or if your concept art has this sort of style, then I think Cinema 4D can be a nice tool. Like maybe it's more worth it investing there, because it can do a lot of the same things that Blender can do, some modeling, rendering, all these things, right? But then it also has this kind of nice motion graphics part that is a bit stronger than what we see in Blender. Blender can also do some stuff, but if very specifically, no, that really fits my style, then I think it makes a lot of sense to use Cinema 4D. If not, then again, go into CAM Blender. Just the way I see it. Alright, and I just want to mention Modo. I think Modo for a while was gaining a lot of traction, especially in terms of modeling. Still lots of modelers who use Modo because the modeling toolset is very competent. And I've seen lots of concept artists who have used it and still use it. But I think the modeling toolset is pretty competent in Blender also. And I think there are some tools that are better in Modo and some tools that are worse in Modo just with modeling, and some tools that are better in Blender for modeling and some tools that are worse for modeling in Blender. And it comes down to preference, but I think at the end of the day you're getting so much more with Blender versus what you're getting in terms of modeling. So maybe if your workflow is really modeling heavy, some very specific hard surface things, then maybe Modo is a good companion thing, but I would still use Blender for developing the other things. I think that just makes sense. If you're really concerned about the hard surface modeling aspect, then there's some other tools that we'll look at later. Okay, then let's talk about 3D Code. 3D Code is a pretty interesting software. I definitely see it used a lot in the industry. Lots of concept artists who are using it. It's interesting because it has this voxel sculpting option, right? You can do several things, and you can do a little bit of modeling, some UV, some retopology, and some texturing. But I think primarily what people are using it for is this voxel sculpting feature. And this allows you to sculpt kind of carefree from topology, which is sometimes pretty nice when you want to go, I just want to have a form here, and that's where I want to put that form, and you don't worry about the stretching and stuff, and you can just make that form without having any topology, and that can be very, very, very powerful. And I think for those use cases, I see a lot of people making pretty detailed assets very fast that obviously do not have very nice topology for film or games or something like that, but for concept art where topology does not matter, it makes a lot of sense. So if you want to do these kinds of assets with lots of detail very fast and very freeform, then I think that 3D Code has actually overtaken some of that space that ZBrush had before, because it's more carefree, where ZBrush was still topology dependent a little bit, and the workflow and some of the additional tools that are in 3D Code just line up with concept artistry a bit more than ZBrush for some tasks, 3D Code might be an option for you. For me personally, I've only used 3D Code a couple of times. It's not really my kind of tool, mostly because I like staying really clean. So I like using as little software as possible. So I pretty much just try to replicate what they do in 3D Code in Blender. And sometimes that doesn't work out, and it would probably be fast for me to use 3D Code. But I like exploring and figuring out how to do things in Blender, hence why the channel is the way it is. So that's what I'll continue to do. I won't be promoting 3D Code at any point. But I do think if it's something you're looking to explore and these kinds of tools, then 3D Code is a really viable option. Then let's look at ZBrush. So ZBrush, probably everyone knows this by now. ZBrush is the de facto sculpting tool, right? It's amazing for sculpting. It's what everyone uses for sculpting, from low end to high end to the most incredibly detailed 200 million polygon models that we see in feature films, and it can do a lot of things. It's a strange software. It has its own ways of doing things, and that's fine. And if you're doing really high-res detailed things, like sculpting creatures or something, really high detail things, then you should use ZBrush. There's really no other option for you to use. I think it's the one to use, and it's definitely the most capable one. And also it's a standard in terms of sculpting. And it also has some really nice features in terms of hard surface modeling. There's some really cool things you can do there that you can't really do anywhere else in the same kind of speed. And people who are really adept at using ZBrush in this way, they can produce some amazing results. A little bit the same story for me about ZBrush and 3D Code, except that I've used ZBrush for many years. I've also used Maya for many years. Both of those I used in school for several years. And I think ZBrush is fine. I just prefer to do sculpting in Blender, and the past couple of years, the sculpting tools in Blender have really just expanded. And for concept artistry, staying in that flow where you don't have to switch software and export things, it just makes more sense for me to be in Blender, because then I can sculpt, and then the modeling is, I think, a lot faster in Blender, and I can do all these other things, and I can see everything with nice textures and so on. So it just makes more sense, because I never push, super high detail. And you can still do high detail things in Blender, not quite to the same extent of ZBrush, but I think for concept artistry, it's more than enough. Check out ZBrush if you're really into those things for concept art. And then in terms of hard surface, there's this nice newer tool called Moy 3D. There's probably also some other tools similar to it, but I think Moy 3D is the one I'm seeing most people getting into. This one's really interesting because it's more of a CAD-like shape software. You can do all kinds of hard surfacey things with correct booleans and all these things without really caring about topology. It's just more this free form, really awesome tool, and it's a very focused tool, which I think is really nice. And if you're doing a lot of hard surface like robots and vehicles, then I definitely recommend checking out Moy 3D more than checking out something like Modo, because it allows for a really different skill set that Blender doesn't really provide. And once again, it's that trade-off, and I think having Moy 3D as an addition can be really powerful. I have not tried Moy 3D, but I've seen some really cool things. I've considered trying it if I ever got around to doing something really hard surface, but I think I'd rather just find a workflow in Blender, once again just because I like staying clean, but it has been more tempting than some of the other ones, because the workflow and what you can do in it is so different. It's not poly modeling, it's a different way of doing it. So I would check out Moy 3D if that interests you. Alright, then I want to look at some VR tools, and there's pretty much Gravity Sketch and Oculus Medium. If you haven't heard about either, they are essentially sculpting tools in VR. They're a little bit similar, they can do some different things. Gravity Sketch is more maybe doing hard surfacey things, and Oculus Medium is definitely really nice for kind of that ZBrush experience, but in VR. Now, the downside is you need to have a VR headset, and you need to have all the peripherals to do it, so you can't just do it on your computer. There you have some other tools, right? But if you have that, then Oculus Medium and Gravity Sketch are really cool tools. I don't really want to say one is better than the other. I see more use of Oculus Medium out there, but I've tried Gravity Sketch and I tried Oculus Medium. I think they're both pretty nice, but I've never integrated them into my workflows. But I think that blocking out sketching, sculpting kind of way, there's a fastness to Oculus Medium that you can't even get in ZBrush that I think is really valid. And I actually think there's a lack of that kind of a tool on PC. I definitely think we could get a more free-form kind of sculpting tool on the PC. 3D Code is probably the thing that comes the closest, I think, where ZBrush is a bit more like stretch and go, and 3D Code you can kind of just place things and voxel things out. But Oculus Medium almost provides that, but even nicer. And Gravity Sketch has some really cool tools for stretching things out and stuff like that. Look at both if you have some kind of VR stuff going on. Both are pretty interesting. Then a little sidestep into looking at real-time tools. So for that I mean Unreal Engine and the other ones, Unity, CryEngine, all these things. I think Unreal Engine is probably your biggest bet right here. And I think something to consider here is that historically when you're doing a film or a game or something like that, at some point you're doing a vertical slice, and that could be a visual vertical slice or technical vertical slice. And what happens there is that the artists on board on the project, they try to do a small version of the full project just to demonstrate the visuals or the technicalities or something. And I think with the usability and user friendliness of Unreal Engine and these other tools now, and the accessibility, is that concept artists can start pushing themselves into this direction more, where they can start doing some of this vertical slice things for the visuals, if it's just about feeling the visuals in 3D, not necessarily technically, and that can then flow back into the concept art thing. So the whole idea of concept art can be stretched there a little bit, and I think that's what the interesting part about Unreal Engine is that it looks very good and it's very impressive, and you can have these massive scenes and grand environments that you can't really have in something like Blender. Unreal Engine though, you can't create assets, you can't model things, or you can, but you shouldn't. It's a very rudimentary. But it's great if you have a bunch of assets and then you're laying things out. You can really create vast scenes that you wouldn't be able to do in traditional 3D packages in kind of that real-time flow. If that's important to you, is scouting around in real time and finding angles and building your environment out. If that's part of your conceptual workflow, then something like Unreal Engine or the other real-time things makes a lot of sense. But I would say it's always a companion tool to having a core 3D package for creating assets, unless you are a specific concept artist who just does that, gets asset and then places things around. But it's a little bit of a different thing, but it's an emerging thing, and I can see it growing a lot bigger. So something to look out for there. There's a potential for doing concept art in something like that. And then the very last thing to look at is traditional 3D. So that's pretty much sculpting or working with something physically. This used to be a much bigger thing in the past, sculpting something physically and then transferring it. It's really not done anymore. It's if anyone's doing it, they're doing it for legacy reasons, they're just doing it because they want to do it that way. Nobody's gonna require you to be able to hand sculpt things, unless maybe you work in stop motion or something like that. But I think that's the one edge case where it's demanded. The rest are probably more happy if you do it digitally. It's just so much easier. But there's one aspect of the traditional and sort of physical workflow that is still very usable, that I actually see a lot of people not doing, and that is taking a step back from your screen and just trying to imagine the space around you, and not just looking at your screen, but feel where it is, right? If that makes sense. Imagine you're doing a character or something, posing as that character or posing as the creature. What pose is it? It's really gonna help you come closer to what that creature will look like when you're making it on screen. And I think that takes part in the physical world, and it's distancing yourself from the digital. And I think it's a really important part of the whole workflow is to still, see it from the viewer's point, right? Imagining yourself there, trying to imagine your environment where you are. So if you never take a step back and imagine the space around you, I think you should try doing that. And just here in the very end, I want to add some additional tools to the list here. So something to consider is PureRef. If you've never used PureRef before, it is this amazing tool that you can use on your computer for storing reference. It's essentially just a little canvas where you can put all the pictures, and it's way better than using stuff in Photoshop or other software. I think PureRef is definitely the one to use. Even if you want an online version of it, there's something called Miro, Miro.com. There you can have a sort of similar board with pictures. I think it's nice for bigger projects, but if you have just a piece, an art piece you need to do, then I think PureRef is the one to use. Additionally, there's a tool called Sketcher. Sketcher is a sort of a filter gallery for applying these kind of painterly filters to your render. So if you're rendering something out in 3D, Sketcher can be quite nice. I might do a demo on it in the future, but it's really valuable. It's kind of similar to photo filters in Photoshop, but a little bit more advanced, and it can do some pretty nice stuff that you can blend in with your things when working on a 2D image. And then lastly, there are the assortment of asset libraries out there that are super helpful if you're working in 3D. And one of the big ones is Megascans. So if you've never heard of Megascans, maybe you have, then Megascans is this big library inside a software called Bridge, and made by Quixel, now owned by Epic. So there's a lot of names there, but Megascans, I think most people call it, is a library of stones, rocks, geometry data, photographs from the real world, that you can sort of just place in either Unreal Engine or something like Blender or other 3D software and mix the things around. I use it myself, and it's pretty commonly used, so take a look at that one as well. And that's pretty much the end for this video. Of course, this is all just my opinion and how I see the things. You could have a different point of view, and there might be some software I haven't mentioned, but please continue the discussion in the comments. And also, this is a new format. I don't know if it's great, but let me know in the comments if you hate it. And I also know the camera is terrible. I will get a nicer one if I do more of these. So we'll see what happens. But nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something. I hope it will be useful. And that's it for now. And thanks for watching.